Hello, today's date is November 16th, 2007. My name is Kendra Cernicki. I'm a graduate student in the Salem State University history program. I have the great pleasure of being joined by Pat Wilson, who is a descendant of Mary Eastie. We are here today as part of the Salem Witch Shroud Descendant Oral History Project. Hello, thank you for joining me.
Hi, nice to be here.
I see you were born in Washington, D.C. and went to high school near Philadelphia.
That's
Where did
right.
you spend most of your time growing up?
Well, since my father was a professor, we moved a lot in the beginning because he was working his way up the academic ladder. So I lived in Ithaca for Cornell, Michigan State was East Lansing, and then we came to Philadelphia area, and then he was at the University of Pennsylvania.
Oh. Can you tell me a little bit about what life was like growing up?
You know what? I mean, of course, it was in what we always, well, I think everyone feels they grew up in a great time. My friends and I feel like our generation had a great time. There was a lot of freedom. At that time, adults weren't watching over kids as carefully as they are now, and we loved it that way. So essentially, you took off and showed up for dinner, you know, and we were on our bikes, we were doing lots of things. It was pretty good.
How would your parents describe you as a child?
Independent, because they encouraged that, and I really was independent. I like to explore, like to do things, I like to go off with friends. And yet at the same time, because I was raised at that time of the century, I was pretty obedient.
Okay. Did your parents stress the importance of family history?
You know, my parents didn't so much, but my paternal grandmother did. And when I went to see her in Indiana, she would sort of like sketch out different things in the family tree. At that time, I was not interested in pursuing any of that. I liked hearing about it, but I hadn't found my own little spark of interest in it.
Okay, that actually leads me to my next question, which is, were there any family members, maybe other than that paternal grandmother, that sparked your interest in the Salem Witch Trials, or that maybe just spoke about the Salem Witch Trials a lot?
They didn't talk about it much. Now, my father, who is a direct descendant, said that he thought, or it seemed like there was a rumor that we had had a witch or an accused person accused of being a witch in the past. And then when I brought my younger son to Salem, because he and his friend wanted to see what was happening, and they were hoping they could be witches. And so we went to the Witch Museum, and when I saw the name Mary Eastie, I thought, well, she's not related to us because that's not how we spell our name, and it's not how we pronounce it. And as you know, back then, people had many different ways their names were spelled. I didn't understand that until recently, so I thought that we could not be part of the same family. But she's in our family, and we spell it Estey, E-S-T-E-Y, and everyone from Isaac Estey, her husband, right on down, we spell it E-S-T-E-Y. So it was only when I started working after I retired, I started doing something with Ancestry.com, started going back through the generations, and there she was. And suddenly it all fell into place that what my father had suggested was in fact a truth that I don't think he knew much about. I think he just passed it along as something he had heard or learned about, but we didn't have much access to doing family history, you know, in the rank and file. We weren't attuned to how to do that. And it used to be that you had to go to towns and look up things in the town hall, and so we weren't doing it. So when I actually found out that she was my ancestor, my 8th great-grandmother, I was so excited, and because I have a friend living in Danvers, which was Salem Village, I came right up here. She had already walked me past the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, and suddenly I saw, well, that's part of the family too, because she was the sister. And then more and more pieces came together, and then I started looking at different landmarks around town. Not so much the Witches Museum, because I was kind of done with that, but really what was historically still here.
Okay, so you were pretty excited when you found out that this was indeed like a thing, like you said.
It's pretty interesting.
Would you say that that was true for a lot of your family? When these stories are told, did it come out with like a sense of pride?
Well, you know, I find I'm still trying to get them to sort of pay attention. And I keep saying, well, you know, our relative, this was the anniversary of the day she was hanged. And they're sort of interested, but until you really like family history, most of this stuff just doesn't make a lot of difference. I have found that in telling some of my friends, they're amazed sometimes, like, you know, something that they know about is part of my history and part of my family's life.
Have you been able to get any of your family members as interested as you are?
No, I am the one who's leading the charge. But, you know, I do want to share what happens today, and I've sent pictures around to the family of visiting the memorials and all of this. And then I've started watching the films, you know, the PBS film from the 80s or 90s, and read more books about it, so I can really have more sources at my disposal.
What do you think leads to your interest in it? If it wasn't something that you grew up with, you know, the interest surrounding you, is an interest in history?
Well,
or?
you know, part of it is the interest in history, and to find out that my family really arrived so early in this country. And I'm learning more now about American history than I knew in high school, when it was exceedingly boring because it wasn't taught in a way that made it come alive. But I'm finding that history is very lively, and I'm excited to see how we fit into this, to learn more about Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritan ways, and all that was going on in that time.
What do you think caused that kind of shift for you to get interested in it? And
well, it was having someone who was at the Salem witch trials and hanged because of it. And so she kind of led me into all of this. Then I joined a group that represents the family she came from, the Town family. And I'm finding it just opens up more and more. And I'm interested also in what was going on in those times that allowed this to happen. And I think that's why so many people are interested in the witch trials, because it represents something of human nature, but you know, what do we not want to see again? What keeps showing up again? And what lessons are there from it?
so you mentioned that you went on Ancestry.com, and that kind of confirmed what you'd heard in your family. Is that
Yes.
true? Did that kind of help, or did that change anything that you understood about yourself, or did it change how you thought about you and your family at all?
Well, I do feel some pride that the more I learn about the family and all the different branches of it, the more interesting it is, because suddenly we represent all kinds of eras. It's not just the people that I personally know, but it goes back and back. I also like learning about who Mary Esty was as a person, what she represented in this whole procedure, and kind of the stand that she took for herself. I think it's interesting. I read recently that the Salem witch trials were one of the few times that women really had a voice and a strength until we get about to the temperance and the, you know, voting, suffrage movements. So to have women saying so much or accusing so much or whatever, women were definitely showing up front and center at that point.
Other than Ancestry.com, what other methods of research did you use?
Well, there's also FamilySearch.org, which is through the Mormon Church, and that is free. So I found that interesting too. And I live near a Mormon library where they will personally sit down and dig out anything that you want. But I've also read books, although I know those aren't primary sources. I like to see how people interpret what happened. And then some of the documents that I have found, genealogical things, keep referring to the Salem delusion, which is kind of an interesting term for all that was going on.
What do you think the general public knows about the Salem witch trials?
I'm surprised that they don't know as much as I thought, because when I've talked with my friends, they really don't always know that teenage girls were the accusers, or that there were a lot of issues in the town that might have contributed to it, like, arguments over land perimeters and where the lines were between Salem and Topsfield, and lots of personal things that were going on. But also, I think the most surprising thing is when I talk to people and they don't understand that back then, spectral evidence was something. And when you explain it in today's terms, it does boggle people's minds, because they say, imaginary evidence? Well, yeah, that's what it was, and it was pretty popular at that time.
Encouraged even.
Right. So I think it's because the times were so different in what the values were and how procedures took place and how things were done. It's hard for people today to understand that that's part of American history, very different from today, and yet I think we still see patterns of that today, and still very strongly religious groups may have fundamental views of things, as the Puritans did. It was just pretty much one way of doing things. So I find it just very interesting in almost a sociological way.
When you tell your friends that you're a descendant of Mary Esty, what do you tell them? Do you tell them about her or the trials in general? Or?
Well, if they're interested, I will keep going until they show they're no longer interested, because I find it just fascinating. And for some of them, it's just like, oh, well, isn't that something? But others are really curious. Well, how did it happen? And tell me more about it. So I just think it's an amazing story, and the way I'm seeing history now is that history is stories. And the way I remember it from school was it was dates and wars. And of course it's about choices and what people do and how they interact. So I find it very interesting.
About like what time period or what stage in your life did you start to dig more into Mary Esty?
Only a few years ago. So it's all new and so interesting. And, then also I was curious, well, what happened to the first generations after Mary? How did they react to the fact that their mother was very unpopular in Salem Village, and some stigma was still going to be, attached to them? I wasn't able to really dig all of that out, but I did notice that a whole group of Estes headed for Canada. And I think it was not because of the stigma of the witchcraft, but it was because they were loyalists and they wanted to stay with the king when it got time to think about the revolution.
Wow. Where'd you find that information?
As I went through Ancestry.com, some Estes, were coming this way, but then my group headed to Canada, and it took 200 years for them to get back into the United States. And then that was the group that I came from.
Wow. Do you think that the study of genealogy, is important in today's society?
I do, and I try to get my friends interested in doing their genealogy. I say to them, it's kind of like a crossword puzzle. You just get little pieces and more goes together, and you find out things that are so interesting about where you came from and what happened.
What do you find most fascinating about Mary Estes or your ancestors' response to the Salem witch trials?
Well, do you mean to the whole ordeal?
Yes, so
Okay.
Either about Mary herself or specifically, I know you mentioned you were interested in the response to it.
Yes. Well, I felt that for someone who really didn't see herself as part of it at all, she was so composed, and she spoke eloquently, saying that she was certainly innocent, but then she wrote a letter to the governor trying to ask him for some attention, and then she also presented wonderful testimony that was recorded that she gave to the judge in the courtroom. And I felt it was, it really told me something about how strong women were, even though they were very circumspect about certain things back then, that she spoke, respecting the judges and all of the process, but still saying she was never guilty, and she asked that people would not be going through this, that they would spare future people from going through this. And she accepted the fact that she would be dying.
If you weren't related to Mary, do you think you'd still want that lesson to get out there?
Oh, yes. I think it's so amazing, so interesting.
Have you ever been to haunted happenings?
No, because my friend who lives in Danvers says never come to Salem in October, ever, because she's a hospice nurse, and she says she can't even drive across town in October, so I have not come to that.
How do you feel, if you know about it, how do you feel about Haunted Happenings association with the Salem witch trials?
Well, I don't know entirely what that incorporates, but it does bring me to some thoughts that I feel like Salem has certainly made lots of money by making this a spectacle. Mm-hmm. And, if that was the thing that worked for them, okay, that's what they did. But I think it demeaned the story and made it very popular, kind of funny, kind of witchy, and so I don't want to be a part of the haunted thing, because I don't think there's any haunting in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I don't like to call her a witch. I say to people, she was a woman accused of witchcraft, and she was executed. Mm-hmm. But she was not a witch, and so what I like about the newest memorial that I went to see is that it seems like there's a little more dignity now, and a little less excitement about the whole tourist thing. Mm-hmm. And I don't mind whatever Salem wants to do about their economy, good for them. But personally, I am for giving them a lot of dignity and respect for what happened.
Which memorial have you visited most recently?
The one at Proctor's Ledge, which was, I guess, dedicated earlier this year.
Can you describe it?
Well, my friends and I, my friend in Danvers and someone else from my hometown area, we knew where it was. We put Proctor's Ledge in the GPS, and we were driving around and around, and we weren't seeing anything. And we didn't know that it was really Pope Street at Proctor. So finally we asked the mailman that we saw, where is Proctor's Ledge? And we were 1 block away, but on the back instead of on the front. Once we went there, we took pictures, and I just enjoyed how beautifully it was done and how respectful it was.
What does the memorial look like?
Well, as I recall it, it's like a semicircle with the individual, and it's sort of a long stone bench with a back, and chronologically the victims are put with like a little seat, so to speak, in that, and all 20 people, 19 women and 1 man, are honored. And there's some nice landscaping, and because we now feel that's where it really happened, it's a nice way of remembering it.
And I was going to ask, do you think that is a good way to memorialize those victims? Is there a better way?
That's a really good question, Kendra. I'm very comfortable in how the town has been doing it. It seems like probably in the last 10 years things have been very nice, as different memorials have been created. One, I think, near the Meeting House area. I visited them, and they seem respectful, and no one's really making money from it. It's just, this is what it is, come and look and think about it. So I feel like that's very, very good. I like that.
What lessons from the Salem witch trials have we learned, or maybe should we learn more or better? Because I know you mentioned that the general public doesn't seem to know a whole lot about the Salem witch trials. What would you want them to know? Maybe is a better way to say that.
Well, it is such a good question. I still ponder that myself. When Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, he was using the Salem witch trials as a parallel to McCarthyism. So, and you even hear now, like, well, you're having a witch trial. So people know the concept of it. But I feel like, well, have we really learned anything? And unfortunately, I suspect we haven't, because we do keep learning the same lessons again and again. You know, every time there's a war, someone says, well, that's there, never again with that. Well, it only takes about 20 years until it comes again. So I don't know if this is just human nature. You know, the reasons that this happened for Mary, there were a lot of personal things, neighborhood issues, church issues, legal issues, but those things are still present in our lives today. So I'm not sure, maybe we wouldn't go as far, but there are still probably some hints of that kind of thing happening.
How would you like the general public to look at Mary Eastie?
Well, I guess just, of course, most of them are really not going to know about her individually, but I would like them to just know that she has a story like all 19 of those women and the man, that the stories really bear some looking into. The fact that the people who said they weren't witches were hanged, and the people who said they were witches escaped, got to spend time in jail, and then went home afterwards. It's just interesting stuff, but it's, you know, not everything about our history is good stuff. Some of it is really sad or scary or unfortunate, and those are our things to carry as well.
And I don't mean to double back, but
Yeah.
we talked about a little bit about how the generation after Mary Eastie dealt with the trials.
Yes.
What did you uncover when you were looking into that?
Well, I did find out that her husband, who was, you know, fairly well-to-do for the town, kept trying to clear her name, and he spent the next 20 years apparently working on that, and finally was paid 20 pounds, which they felt was for his sadness, you know, that's for what happened. Of course, he also had to pay for her expenses at jail, so that was something. But I don't really know how the next generation felt, how her children felt. But by the time you got to her grandchildren, they were the ones that were leaving Massachusetts and heading to Canada. I don't know if at that point they were still thinking about the witch trials or just thinking America is not going in the direction we want to be a part of. But I would love to know more about what it was really like in the town after this all happened. I know that some of the accusers apologized and were brought back into church, etc. But how do you get over that and start getting along with the neighbors that you didn't get along with a month ago, and now everything's okay again? Yeah. I cannot imagine.
I know one of the strategies that were used was intermarrying. So we have the accusers that are, or descendants of accusers, marrying into the families of those who were accused.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
Well, actually, that's probably the best way to get over it. And they didn't have that many people to pick from anyway, so I guess the field looked pretty attractive. I'm all for that. I mean, whatever happened, they were all good families. Some funny, crazy things happened, but I believe they were all good people, and I like to think that they all settled down afterwards.
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that I didn't specifically ask you about? I guess I just find the whole thing amazing that it wasn't young women that were accused, it was older women. And, you know, apparently at the time, people thought the Salem village had a lot of issues and they didn't settle down very easily. They were always upset about something. So I would love to learn more and look forward to finding out more, but I just find that what I have learned is so interesting, and I do want to share it with people. Awesome. Do you intend on continuing to do your research and learn more?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks
I really
so
appreciate
much.
you coming
Great talking with you.
too.